In the heart of the world lies a region where history has never stood still, a land of shifting borders, competing faiths, and endless battles for power. The Middle East, where continents meet and civilizations were born, became a chessboard for empires, invaders, and ideologues. Its borders were not carved by mountains or rivers but by treaties, wars, and oil lines drawn in dust and blood by hands often far from the desert itself. From the twilight of the Ottoman Empire to the present day, maps have been redrawn again and again, each new border carrying the scars of conflict and the ambitions of those who sought to control it. When the Ottoman Empire collapsed after World War I, European powers rushed to divide its remains, drawing artificial borders that ignored tribes, faiths, and histories. The Sykes-Picot Agreement, colonial mandates, and later Cold War alliances stitched together fragile states from the remnants of empire nations whose people often shared little more than imposed boundaries. The discovery of oil turned deserts into strategic prizes, fueling both prosperity and peril. Revolutions, coups, and wars followed, each reshaping the region's identity and igniting new rivalries that continue to this day. To understand the Middle East today, from the conflicts in Syria and Iraq to the power plays of Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Israel, one must journey through this turbulent past. The story of the Middle East is not just one of war, but of resilience and reinvention. It is a chronicle of ambition and betrayal, of survival against all odds. In tracing the shifting sands of its history, we uncover not only how borders were drawn, but how entire peoples were forever changed by the forces that sought to define them. When the Ottoman Empire crumbled at the end of World War I, it marked not only the end of a centuries-old dynasty, but also the beginning of an entirely new geopolitical order in the Middle East. For over 400 years, the Ottoman sultans had ruled vast territories stretching from the Balkans to the Arabian Peninsula, maintaining a delicate balance among diverse ethnic and religious groups. But by 1918, exhaustion, internal decay, and defeat in war left the empire in ruins. Into this void stepped the European powers, primarily Britain and France, eager to shape the region to serve their own imperial ambitions. Behind closed doors, diplomats in London and Paris drafted the infamous Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916, a secret plan to divide Ottoman lands into spheres of influence long before the war even ended. The map they drew ignored history, culture, and community, cutting across tribal lands, splitting ethnic groups, and combining rival sects within arbitrary new borders. The deserts of Arabia, the Fertile Crescent of Mesopotamia, and the ancient Levant became bargaining chips in a geopolitical game. Britain took control of what would become Iraq, Transjordan, and Palestine, while France claimed Syria and Lebanon. The lines on paper seemed clean and decisive, but on the ground they were seeds of endless discord. For the people who lived under Ottoman rule, Arabs, Kurds, Armenians, Assyrians, and countless others, the promised dawn of independence never came. Britain and France spoke of liberation, yet what emerged was colonial subjugation under new names. Mandate systems established by the League of Nations disguised control as guardianship, with Western officials ruling through local elites while exploiting the region's resources and strategic routes. The British fortified their hold over oil-rich Iraq and the Suez Canal, while the French imposed rigid control over Syria and Lebanon, fracturing them into smaller sectarian entities to weaken any unified opposition. Resentment grew quickly. Arab leaders who had fought alongside the Allies during the war, believing in the promise of self-determination, felt betrayed when the secret pacts were revealed. The famous correspondence between Britain and Sharif Hussein of Mecca, promising Arab independence in return for revolt against the Ottomans, was exposed as hollow diplomacy. Instead of freedom, Arabs found themselves once again under foreign rule, their lands renamed and reorganized for European convenience. The anger this betrayal sparked would echo for generations, fueling nationalist uprisings and resistance movements across the region. In Iraq, Britain's attempt to merge three vastly different Ottoman provinces, Sunni Arab, Shia Arab, and Kurdish, into a single nation created immediate unrest. Rebellions broke out in 1920, brutally suppressed by British forces. The artificial unity imposed from above never truly reconciled the divisions below, setting the stage for decades of instability and sectarian violence. In Syria, France faced a similar challenge as it divided the country into sectarian mini-states to prevent a strong Arab identity from forming. This divide-and-rule strategy ensured control but left deep scars in the national psyche, scars that would resurface in later civil wars and coups. Meanwhile, the British Mandate in Palestine became a powder keg. Britain's conflicting promises, support for a Jewish homeland in the Balfour Declaration of 1917, and reassurance to Arab leaders of self-governance, created irreconcilable tensions between Jewish and Arab communities. The seeds of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict were planted not by ancient hatreds alone, but by these overlapping imperial agendas. As waves of Jewish immigrants arrived under British protection, clashes over land and identity turned increasingly violent, drawing the world's attention to a region that had become the heart of post-war turmoil. The colonial carve-up of the Middle East was not just about borders, it was about control of power, trade, and oil. Western powers viewed the region less as a collection of nations and more as a strategic corridor linking Europe to Asia and Africa. Pipelines, ports, and protectorates were drawn to secure access, not stability. By prioritizing imperial interests over local realities, Britain and France ensured that the Middle East would remain fractured long after their mandates ended. Even when independence movements succeeded in the mid-20th century, the states that emerged were burdened with borders that did not reflect their peoples, artificial creations destined to struggle for legitimacy. What was left behind was a mosaic of nations, stitched together by colonial hands but divided by history, faith, and resentment. The collapse of the Ottoman Empire did not bring clarity or unity. It unleashed a century of competition and mistrust. In replacing one empire with another, the West redrew the Middle East, not as a map of nations but as a fault line of future conflict, one that would continue to quake for generations to come. In the wake of the colonial carve-up, the Middle East entered a turbulent era of awakening, a time when its peoples sought to reclaim their destiny from foreign control and imposed boundaries. Nationalism surged like a tide across the Arab world, driven by a longing for unity, pride, and sovereignty. Yet, even as Arab nationalism rose, another force, Zionism, was reshaping the same landscape, giving birth to a new nation and igniting one of the most enduring conflicts of the modern age. The struggle for independence was no longer just against colonial powers, but also over identity itself, who belonged, who ruled, and who had the right to call these ancient lands home. The Arab Revolt of 1916 had promised liberation from Ottoman rule, but the betrayal of those hopes under the mandates had left deep bitterness. Out of this disillusionment grew the idea of Arab nationalism, championed by figures such as Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt, who dreamed of a single Arab destiny, united, strong, and free from Western domination. Across the Middle East, from Baghdad to Damascus and Cairo to Algiers, movements rose, demanding monarchies installed by colonial powers were challenged by republics born of revolution. The pulse of independence beat through the streets, and slogans of unity echoed across the deserts and cities alike. But even as Arabs struggled to define themselves as one people, another movement, Zionism, sought to redefine the Jewish people as a nation reborn in their ancestral homeland. After centuries of persecution and the horrors of the Holocaust, the global momentum for a Jewish state culminated in the declaration of the State of Israel in 1948. To Jews, it was a miracle, the realization of a biblical promise. To Palestinians and the Arab world, it was catastrophe, al-Nakba, the disaster, as over 700,000 Palestinians were displaced or forced from their homes. The 1948 Arab-Israeli War not only redrew the map, but tore through the fabric of the Middle East's social and political order. Israel emerged victorious and established its place in the region, but the Arab nations surrounding it were left humiliated and divided, their unity shattered by defeat. The wars that followed only deepened these divisions. The Suez Crisis of 1956 revealed the fragile balance between nationalism and imperial legacy. When Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, Britain, France, and Israel launched a joint invasion, hoping to reclaim their influence. Yet, under pressure from the United States and the Soviet Union, the invaders withdrew, marking the symbolic end of European dominance in the Middle East and elevating Nasser as a hero of Arab pride. The event signaled that the struggle for independence was not just political, but psychological, a fight for dignity and control over one's own destiny. Then came the Six-Day War of 1967, a lightning conflict that would once again redefine borders and identities. Israel, in a preemptive strike, seized the Sinai Peninsula, Gaza Strip, West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights. In less than a week, the Arab world lost territories rich in history, faith, and symbolism. The defeat was devastating, not just militarily, but emotionally. It fractured the dream of Arab unity and ushered in a new era of regional rivalries. For Israel, it solidified a sense of invincibility and survival. For Palestinians, it deepened their struggle for nationhood. The refugee camps that spread across Lebanon, Jordan, and Gaza became both symbols of loss and crucibles of resistance, fueling decades of unrest. In the years that followed, nationalism evolved, sometimes colliding with religion, sometimes merging with it. In Egypt, Nasser's vision of Pan-Arabism gave way to Anwar Sadat's pragmatism, culminating in the 1979 peace treaty with Israel, a move that split the Arab world between those seeking reconciliation and those demanding continued resistance. In Syria and Iraq, Ba'athist regimes rose, blending socialism, militarism, and nationalism into powerful but repressive states. Each new leader claimed to represent the true spirit of Arab unity, yet all too often, their rivalries perpetuated division. Meanwhile, Islam began reasserting itself as a political force. The failure of secular nationalism and the enduring injustice of the Palestinian question gave rise to movements that sought not only liberation from Western influence but a return to faith as the foundation of governance. The Iranian Revolution of 1979 would soon explode onto the regional stage, challenging both monarchies and Western-backed republics alike. Every war, every revolution, every border shift etched deeper lines into the Middle East's identity. Independence had not brought peace, it had merely transformed the battlefield. Where once the fight was against empires, now it was between nations, ideologies, and faiths. The Arab-Israeli conflict, the rivalries between republics and monarchies, and the ideological battle between secularism and Islamism, all coalesced into a complex web of alliances and betrayals. Through these wars of independence and identity, the Middle East became a living paradox, a region united by shared history, yet divided by its interpretations. Its nations were born from both aspiration and anguish, their sovereignty forged in struggle, their borders redrawn by victory and loss alike. The century that followed the fall of empires did not bring stability, but it did bring awakening, a fierce, unending effort by millions to define who they were and where they belonged, in a world still haunted by the maps drawn a generation before. As the 20th century progressed, the Middle East's importance grew far beyond its geography or faith. It became the world's beating economic heart. Pulsing with oil, beneath its deserts lay the resource that would define modern power. The discovery of vast petroleum reserves in Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and the Gulf transformed the region from a collection of fragile post-colonial states into the centerpiece of global politics. Oil was not just energy, it was leverage, wealth, and control. But with this new fortune came foreign ambition. As the Cold War unfolded, the Middle East became less a region of independent nations, and more a chessboard where the United States and the Soviet Union moved their pieces, each seeking dominance over the lifeblood of the industrial age. The first great struggle for oil and influence came in Iran. Once a symbol of Western-backed modernization, Iran became the site of a covert war for control of its resources. In 1951, Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh nationalized the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, challenging British control and igniting Western panic. Fearing both the loss of oil and Soviet encroachment, the CIA and MI6 orchestrated a coup in 1953 that toppled Mossadegh and reinstated the Shah. The act restored Western access to Iranian oil but shattered local faith in democracy, replacing it with autocracy and resentment. That resentment would later explode in 1979 with the Iranian Revolution, when Ayatollah Khomeini's rise turned Iran from a Western ally into an Islamic republic defying both East and West. The revolution in Iran reshaped the balance of power overnight. For the first time, a major oil-producing nation openly rejected American influence, replacing secular nationalism with revolutionary Islamism. Across the region, monarchs trembled and superpowers recalculated. The United States, determined to contain Iran's influence and protect its oil routes, deepened its alliance with Saudi Arabia, a kingdom whose conservative monarchy presented itself as both a guardian of Islam's holiest sites and a reliable partner in oil and arms. The Saudi-U.S. relationship became the backbone of American influence in the region. Oil for protection, stability for loyalty. But it also fueled contradictions. Washington's support for autocratic regimes in the name of stability often sowed the very instability it feared. The Cold War's shadow stretched across the Middle East, turning local conflicts into global flashpoints. The Soviet Union sought to counter U.S. influence by supporting socialist and revolutionary movements in Egypt, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen. Meanwhile, the United States armed monarchies and right-wing regimes to contain communism's spread. Proxy wars and coups became the new form of empire building. In Egypt, Nasser's flirtation with Moscow brought Soviet aid and arms, but his eventual death and Sadat's pivot toward Washington symbolized how alliances in the Middle East were as fluid as its sand dunes. In Iraq, the Ba'ath Party seized power with Western tolerance, only to later clash with the U.S. and its allies. Every revolution and coup seemed to carry the fingerprints of outside powers. The competition reached a fever pitch in Afghanistan. In 1979, when the Soviet Union invaded to support its allied government, the U.S. saw an opportunity to bleed its rival dry. Through Pakistan, Washington funneled billions of dollars in weapons to Islamist fighters, the Mujahideen, who waged a fierce guerrilla war. The strategy succeeded militarily, forcing the Soviets into a costly retreat, but the long-term consequences were catastrophic. The same militant networks that emerged from that conflict would later evolve into Al-Qaeda and other extremist groups, turning America's Cold War victory into a modern nightmare. Meanwhile, oil wealth remade societies and regimes. The Gulf monarchies, flush with petrodollars after the 1973 oil embargo, used their newfound riches to consolidate power and influence global markets. Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and the UAE became not only economic giants but also ideological forces, exporting Wahhabi conservatism and shaping Islamic discourse worldwide. The 1973 embargo itself, launched in response to Western support for Israel during the Yom Kippur War, demonstrated the region's ability to wield oil as a weapon. Prices quadrupled, economies trembled, and suddenly the Middle East held the power to bend the world's superpowers to its will. Yet power bred conflict. When Iraq, under Saddam Hussein, invaded Iran in 1918, the world once again turned its gaze toward the Persian Gulf. The Iran-Iraq War, one of the longest and bloodiest of the century, was fueled by ideology, ambition, and foreign intervention. Western and Gulf states secretly backed Saddam as a bulwark against revolutionary Iran, while the Soviets supplied both sides at different times. For 8 brutal years, millions were killed or displaced, cities reduced to rubble, and borders left unchanged. The war ended nothing but sowed the seeds for future catastrophe: the 1990 invasion of Kuwait, the Gulf War, and eventually, the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003. Through these decades, the Middle East was not merely a battlefield. It was a mirror reflecting the greed and paranoia of global powers. Oil, ideology, and influence dictated every decision, while ordinary people bore the cost and lost lives, shattered nations, and crushed dreams of freedom. What began as colonial interference had evolved into a global contest where the value of oil outweighed the value of human life. Superpowers rose and fell, but the instability they created became self-sustaining. As the Cold War ended, the old rivalries between East and West gave way to new ones between faiths, factions, and nations. The borders drawn in the Age of Empire had once again been redrawn, not on maps, but in the hearts and histories of millions caught between power and survival. The dawn of the 21st century revealed that the Middle East's struggle with borders and identity was far from over. While the 20th century had seen lines drawn by empires, revolutions, and superpowers, the new century witnessed a resurgence of popular uprisings, civil wars, and extremist movements that challenged the very notion of sovereignty. The Arab Spring of 2010-2011 swept across the region like a wildfire, toppling long-standing autocrats in Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, and Yemen. Protesters demanded freedom, dignity, and representation, rejecting regimes that had promised stability but delivered repression. In some nations, uprisings led to fleeting victories. In others, they unleashed prolonged chaos. Borders on maps remained, but in reality, control of territories shifted daily as revolutionary fervor clashed with entrenched power structures. Nowhere was this more evident than in Syria, where peaceful protests against Bashar al-Assad's government escalated into a full-scale civil war. The conflict drew in a tangle of local militias, regional powers, and global actors, each with competing interests. Turkey, Iran, Russia, and the United States each pursued their agendas, turning Syria into a proxy battlefield where allegiances shifted and borders became fluid lines of contestation. Millions were displaced internally or forced to flee as refugees, creating humanitarian crises that spilled across neighboring countries. The Syrian war exemplified how modern conflicts did more than redraw maps. They reshaped the lives, identities, and futures of entire populations, often leaving scars that no treaty could erase. Amid this chaos arose ISIS, the Islamic State, which for a brief moment sought to erase borders entirely. Declaring a caliphate across parts of Iraq and Syria, ISIS attempted to impose a vision of governance that ignored existing nation-states, tribal divisions, and historical boundaries. Its rise demonstrated the enduring allure of identity-based politics, combining religion, ideology, and conquest to challenge both regional authorities and international coalitions. Yet, the group's brutal methods, internal conflicts, and coordinated military campaigns by local and global forces led to its territorial defeat. Even as ISIS lost physical control, its ideological legacy persisted, inspiring further unrest and reminding the world how fragile the modern map could be. Beyond the dramatic headlines, the Middle East continues to wrestle with sectarianism and nationalism, forces deeply rooted in the region's historical trajectory. Sunni-Shia rivalries, Kurdish independence movements, and ethno-religious divides persistently influence politics, alliances, and military strategy. Iraq remains a fragmented state where governance is contested between Baghdad and semi-autonomous Kurdish regions. Lebanon struggles with sectarian deadlock, while Yemen's civil war pits Houthi rebels against a Saudi-backed government. In each case, foreign interventions, whether by regional powers, global superpowers, or international coalitions, complicate conflicts, often prioritizing strategic advantage over local stability. Borders drawn long ago, whether by colonial mandates or imperial bargains, are continually questioned, contested, and reimagined on the ground. The legacies of the past remain ever present. Colonial divisions, nationalist experiments, Cold War interventions, and oil-fueled conflicts continue to shape the Middle East's political landscape. Every ceasefire, revolution, and power shift is part of an ongoing effort to redefine sovereignty, identity, and belonging. Maps may bear the names of modern states, but the realities on the ground tell a different story, one of contested cities, shifting allegiances, and communities struggling to protect their heritage, faith, and livelihoods. The tension between imposed borders and lived realities ensures that no line on a map is permanent. Yet amid conflict and fragmentation, the resilience of the people endures. Communities adapt, resist, and rebuild even in the shadow of war. New identities emerge, blending old traditions with modern aspirations, while political movements continue to demand representation and justice. The Middle East's story is not simply one of collapse. It is also a story of perseverance, innovation, and survival against immense odds. The modern map of the Middle East is thus a reflection not only of past ambitions and foreign interventions, but of the enduring human quest for self. Borders may shift, empires may fall, and regimes may rise and crumble, but the struggle for identity, sovereignty, and stability continues to shape the region. Each revolution, each conflict, and each negotiation is another attempt to draw lines that reflect the values, loyalties, and aspirations of the people themselves, reminding the world that in the Middle East, history is never truly finished and the map is never truly fixed.